Chapter 3, Economics Class. Several decades later, in an economics class at a major university, the idea of cooperatism surfaced again. The students in that class had, at one time or another, retold the events that occurred. We are fortunate to have many interviews and personal memoirs of these students, and therefore have the opportunity to relay these events almost entirely in the students' own words. We begin with Patricia Stanton. She recalls, "I was only taking this course to fulfill a requirement. In those days, I had strong political and philosophical views, but had very little interest in economics. I was more interested in the social ramifications of economics than in the actual principles and theories themselves. The discussions always revolved around the economy. What's good for the economy? What's bad for the economy? Why is this good for the economy? Why is this bad for the economy? It was always about the economy instead of about the people. I was always asking the question, is this good for the people? Yes, I know what's good for the economy is supposedly good for the people. However, this inextricable link, this mandated, unquestioned parallel between the two always bothered me. I knew it was somehow true, but deep down I didn't want it to be. I resented the fact that our collective happiness, our collective disposition, our very lives were so subjugated to, so dependent on, so easily manipulated by the changing landscapes and uncertainty of this thing we have created called the economy." One day, I remember the topic came up about unavoidable economic stratification causing unavoidable social stratification, which was a bit off the beaten track for our discussions, and it piqued my interest. I remember thinking, why? Why must this occur? Why is this inevitable? Shouldn't we figure out how to change the economic landscape to more closely align with our ethics? Anyway, I raised my hand and I said, shouldn't the economics of a capitalistic system be more concerned about ethics in society? Why doesn't society attempt to purposefully craft an economy that will accommodate ethics and individual well-being rather than letting a chance-ruled economy dictate the personal and conglomerate lives of society in general? This was something I'd read in a discourse on the function of modern economics in free society. It was such an enlightening concept for me at the time that I committed it to memory and would pull it out at various times whenever I found myself in a relevant political discussion. Usually, it went right over people's heads, but they couldn't help but be impressed, and it gave me a certain advantage with regard to my credibility. However, this class had some very bright intellectual types in it, and our professor, Paul Strickland, was always up for a challenge. I remember Professor Strickland raising his eyebrows. It was evident that this was not the discussion he had planned that day. However, he would occasionally allow us to drift into a somewhat parallel topic just for his own sanity. So he threw it open to the class. "Any takers?" he asked. It was Milt Connolly, who apparently thought I was specifically referring to capitalism as opposed to economics in general, and commented that social stratification was not unique to capitalism. He made the point that all economic systems, whether they admit it or not, cause social stratification. Someone else in class, I think it was Sarah Crandall, she pointed to a possible exception, cooperatism, and said that in that system, there was no economic stratification that forced a similar social stratification. Then Jordan LaMarche chimed in and said that cooperatism wasn't even a valid economic system. In fact, it wasn't an economic system at all. And furthermore, he argued, it was only theoretical, completely impractical, unworkable, and unsustainable in any modern industrial society. Again, Strickland raised his eyebrows. Carter Osborne then said he didn't think cooperatism could be so easily dismissed as invalid and unworkable. He agreed that it never actually had been given a test and admitted it had major difficulties. And although it had definite socialist overtones, theoretically the idea was quite interesting. Morgan Jaspers responded that it could never be implemented on any national level because the logistics alone would be overwhelming. Then I think it was Katie Dessinger who asked, "What is cooperatism? Are we supposed to know this? Is this going to be on the final?" The majority of the class was in the dark and had never heard of cooperatism, myself being one. So Strickland began a brief synopsis of Charlene Beckwith's book, Cooperatism. This definitely grabbed my interest, and apparently I was not alone. Due to the flood of questions and comments that arose, Strickland was eager to capitalize on the students' sudden enthusiasm. He tailored the next few classes to more fully explore cooperatism, which apparently he had always found pragmatically unworkable, but fascinating from a more philosophical humanitarian perspective. That's when that economics class became my favorite class. It pretty much turned out to be everyone's favorite class. We had a good group, which was fortunate because not every group would have become so involved in the topic. But this group, for some reason, got very fired up over the pros and cons of this cooperative system. So Strickland ran with it. The big questions and debates obviously centered around why this could or could not work in a modern industrial society. Many of us at the time were questioning our uncertain future. We were a bit apprehensive about taking that huge step into the real world after college. Money, income, jobs were all looming concerns for us standing on the threshold of entering corporate-run America, the rat race. It was exciting in a way, but also very scary, pondering all the ways your life might turn out that were not on your top 10 list of happy endings. It was a system that could be your best friend or your worst nightmare, depending on your circumstances and their outcomes. And those circumstances could reverse in a heartbeat. So here was this new system that most of us had just been made aware of, and it appeared to be more user-friendly. It seemed to encourage people to explore their dreams throughout their lives within a more accommodating environment. Most of us sort of wished it was the one we were living in. So we pressed with our questions, wanting to know why this couldn't be. We wanted to know why this was impractical and unworkable. To answer those questions, Strickland tasked the class to expand on Charlene's brief sketch of a cooperative system and conjecture how it might look in the context of a modern industrial society such as the United States. What would be the problems? What would be the advantages? Could it work? If not, then why couldn't it work? Or, as the case may be, why could it? And that's how it all began. We now continue with Jordan LaMarche and what he recalls about that class. I was a bit of a know-it-all in those days. I had heard of cooperatism and thought I knew all about it. I considered it to be exactly what my conservative right-wing upbringing, family, and friends had decided it was, just some sort of idealistic, pie-in-the-sky, left-wing, socialistic ridiculousness. Maybe its sentiments were humanitarian and good-hearted, but it was so impractical, so impossible to achieve in the real world, not to mention the fact that it had so many holes, inconsistencies, and loose ends that it ended up contradicting its own principles. I was not open-minded about it at all. So when Sarah made some comment that implied that it should be considered as some sort of economic system, I figured I'd slam dunk this thing and let everyone know that cooperatism doesn't even rate in this category. Then Strickland starts devoting class time to it. What a waste! The rest of the class, however, seemed to be really enthusiastic about it after Strickland explained it. It wasn't surprising that half the class had never even heard of it. Strickland wanted us to discuss why it would not work in a society like ours. I'm thinking, isn't it obvious? The whole premise is absurd. No money, Sure, maybe for some ancient tribe like culture centuries ago, but let's be serious about this. It would be a complete joke and fail miserably in modern times. How would anything get done? It takes capital, it takes investment, it takes financial incentive, and that obviously takes money. Who is going to do anything for free? I thought this was the most preposterous thing I'd ever heard. Unlike some of the other kids, I was excited about jumping into the world of capitalism and making my fortune. I came from a relatively wealthy background and had the encouragement, support, and opportunity to make my mark in the financial world. I didn't want anyone taking that away from me. My parents were able to pick up the tab for my college education, so again, unlike many of the others, I wasn't looking at holding any college debt. Capitalism wasn't scary to me, it was exciting, and it was going to make me a fortune and allow me to live like a king. I was ready to annihilate this cooperatism project. I was ready to prove my uninformed peers that this socialistic system was a waste of time. So I guess I became sort of the sounding board for the class. If they could get their proposals by me, then they must be valid. After much discussion, we all came to the agreement that the fundamental gist of cooperatism revolved around the concept of a specified shifting percent of the population serving as a workforce and supplying the basic needs of society at large without monetary compensation. And the provided services and items would meet the requirements for a middle-class standard of living for everyone. The goal was to do this using the smallest percentage of the population as possible, leaving the remainder of the population work-free. The weekly hours worked by each individual would be the minimal. The task was to adhere as close as possible to Charlene Beckwith's original concept. We would try to make the leap from Charlene's imaginary village to a fully modernized industrial nation. So the first discussion and debate revolved around what the average person or family would need in order for a middle-class lifestyle to be maintained. Professor Strickland required us to define in some way what was meant by basic needs. This was one of the broad concepts in Charlene's writings that was never formally defined. And because of this, her detractors could legitimately question many aspects of the system that were not thoroughly addressed. One of these unresolved questions was, how could society agree on what basic needs meant? People had different priorities, and not everyone's basic needs would necessarily be the same. Strickland insisted that before any progress could be made, this point had to be clearly defined. I was thinking, and I think he was as well, that the discussion would never get past this point. The class would never come to any consensus. Then we could return to our normal class agenda, knowing and agreeing on at least one major reason why cooperatism could never work. This should have been the end of it, because, as expected, no one could agree. We were all just blurting out what we thought should be on the list and arguing against what we thought everyone else's impractical ideas were. But at one point, Mill Connolly suggested we start listing things that were more or less common to the average middle-class household. This seemed reasonable to everyone. Then he said, after comprising this list, we could possibly narrow it again by restricting our choices to things that were more necessary and or regularly used. We drew up a list which included such things as modest dwelling. This might be a house or apartment depending on whether the setting was urban or rural and the size of the family. A variety of foods, all modern utilities, water and sewer, electrical power, phones, appliances, stove, oven, refrigerator, washer and dryer, a furnace, central air, cleaning products, plates, cups, utensils, personal grooming products, clothing, transportation, mass transit, as well as personal vehicles, furniture, computers, refuse services, etc. In short, it included anything that was found to be in regular common use by members of a normal modern household. So if these basic needs could be provided for by the workforce for everyone, then this would be a first step. Then I took the opportunity to remind the class that it was one thing to define these things and quite another to actually provide these things to an entire population. Jay Sherman then said something like, well, we are already providing them for almost everyone who pays for them, and if the demand were to increase tomorrow, I'm sure production would find a way to keep right up. So the only real hurdle would be providing them for free. Exactly, I said.